session. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just a couple of norms as we dive into this webinar this afternoon. I don't know how many of you guys have been engaged in yet, but I just ask that you be active and engage throughout. Please use the chat to ask questions and be as interactive as we can. I usually do these sessions live, and so doing them over Zoom is a little different, but I'd love to hear your questions, and hopefully you'll get the most out of it that way. Do keep yourself muted if you aren't speaking, and then do ask questions again. This is the second day of the 11th annual DC Data Summit, and so just wanted to give a shout out to Lexia and NWEA and Empower K-12 for their support for this summit, and then of course the Charter Alliance that's supporting it as well. For the goal for this session is our learning target is really, I can describe how aligning instruction and performance assessments of critical thinking and problem solving skills move students and teachers towards a robust vision of student achievement. Just take a second, read that to yourself. And as you're doing that, I want you to consider, based on where your role is, what is the way that you teach or support critical thinking skill development in your own communities, and then I'm going to dive into what it looks like at Two Rivers and how we have used a set of performance assessments and developed some performance assessments to support that work at our school. So let's get started. So the flow of this session is really around these three words of define, assess, and teach. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to this project that we undertook about 5 or 6 years ago, and that has been developing over that period of time. And then I'm going to explore each of those components, like how do we define critical thinking skills for both faculty and for students. Then we're going to explore how do we assess it. So that's the data piece. How do we gather some data on whether or not students are developing these skills? And we're going to do a deep dive specifically around problem solving and look at a problem solving task. I'm just going to walk you through the task. If I had you in person, I'd actually have you do it, which is a little bit of fun. And after we get off today, if you're interested, and you have a couple of cups and some paper, I would encourage you to try this out. And then the last piece that I'll talk about is the teach component, which is how do we actually embed this in regular instruction and across disciplines? Because this really, as we think about this work of critical thinking and problem solving, it is situated outside of any particular discipline and is cross-cutting. We're a project-based school, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And we see these as definitely applying within projects, but then outside the projects as well in other disciplines and areas. All right, so I'm going to just dive straight in for the introduction to the project. To start off with, as we think about our mission, we feel like one of the things that is most important to understand about us is that we don't teach just core content and basic skills, but that equally important to our mission is character and collaboration and communication skills. And I won't spend a lot of time on that today, but then this last piece of critical thinking and problem solving skills. We feel like for kids to be successful when they leave us and to really realize our mission, they need more than just the core content of math and literacy skills, or even social studies and science skills. And so as we think about that, we think about our assessment system, and we have lots of tools to assess the core content and basic skills, those classroom assessments and standardized assessments. For those social emotional learning goals around character and collaboration, we have a set of scholarly habits, portfolios, and student-led conference. I'm not going to talk about that data piece today, but that is a place that we continue to build out and think about. And then the last area is our expedition products and performance assessments. And that's really where we're going to spend our time today. And when we talk about expeditions, those are our larger projects. They're 10 to 12-week projects, and kids produce some kind of solution to a problem that's situated in an authentic situation, but that also brings on core content as well as those critical thinking and problem solving skills. And we look to tease those out. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that as we dive into the defining portion. Just looking at that one area of critical thinking and problem solving, we've named 3 different constructs that we assess and teach towards. And those are problem solving, and we'll spend a little bit of time looking at that, and then decision making. And the last is effective reasoning. And that's really about making evidence-based claims, which at least like with the Common Core state standards in literacy, really are situated in the critical writing skills of making evidence-based claims based on reading and things. And so you'll see some overlaps between these different constructs and the Common Core standards, but that they really pull out those skills to see them not just situated in one discipline, as I stated before. So with that, as we think about this, so we define, this is the define, teach, and assess component, is that we feel like that there's a tight system that needs to exist. We need to define our outcomes really clearly so that our staff and our students and our families know what those things are really well. And then we need to have a clear way of collecting data on it to say, how are we doing in moving kids forward in their assessment work? And then last but not least, we need instruction that's aligned to that. One of the big pieces that I think is really important is that we're not a test prep school, at least in the traditional way that people think of test prep schools. Instead, we feel like it's okay to teach towards the test if the test is strong and is actually getting at some authentic use of the work. And so if we have strong performance assessment, so assessment that is getting at the core skills that we want kids to do through that work, then teaching towards that and teaching them the skills not to solve a particular question on a particular test, but being able to have the skills to solve any kind of question is what we're getting at with this critical thinking work. And so the way that we have done that is really focusing on defining critical thinking and problem solving through a set of rubrics. And so you can take a look at those. They are hyperlinked on that document that I shared earlier. And then thinking about how we assess them and looking at some performance assessment. And we'll talk a little more in depth about that in a minute. And then the last piece is teaching towards them. And the way that we do that is using some work from Harvard's Project Zero and the thinking routines that particularly Ron Richard has written about in his book, Making Thinking Visible. And then later in a newer book about cultures of thinking, but really emphasizing what are those regular routines. And I know some people asked about work with families, and so at the end I will speak specifically to that and how we see this work sort of living in our current climate and environment where kids are working remotely. But before we do that, I'm going to play a very short video just to give you kind of an overview of this assessment work and where we see it moving, and particularly how we think about data as formative assessment. Oh, let me go back. Here we go. Oh. Sorry. I had it playing before and it seems to.
It might be muted at the bottom, Jeff.
Yeah, I know. Look, give me 1 second. I'm gonna see if I can fix that. There we go.
After we figured out.
Here we go. Let's try this one more time.
After we figured out our choices, the next step is to figure out what criteria we're going to use to make our choice.
We have to assess what matters. And if we believe that critical thinking matters, we have to measure whether or not we're doing it well.
We talk about assessment in two ways. One is assessment of learning, and then really what we call assessment for learning.
Assessment of learning is summative. It happens at the end of a unit. Assessment for learning is formative. It happens during a unit and directly informs instruction.
So when you're looking at a period of learning has happened and you assess it, you want to know, did my students get what I focused on and taught?
But if I can gather some information as learning is happening, and then use that to give feedback to me, the instructor, as well as the student, then we can improve the learning outcome in the end. And assessment for learning is a powerful tool for doing that.
When teaching complex thinking types, teachers must evaluate each student's progress and make adjustments.
We've built assessments that you can use to assess how well students are doing this thinking along a continuum.
And they're just tasks that are open-ended that allow me to really see their thinking and evaluate what part is missing from that component.
It checks me to make sure that I'm not making assumptions about students.
Yeah, and I think that what happens to me sometimes is that I mix it up, and sometimes I start comparing, contrasting before I think of criteria. Does that happen to you too?
Kind of my stopping point to really focus on the work and what it's telling me.
And think about, what is it that you taught? How did you teach it? And think about, did it work? Did it not work?
We have seen some really surprising information and data that comes out of doing these assessments. Certain kids who are typically sort of the higher academically performing kids struggle with like elements of decision making, and a kid who might not be the most articulate demonstrates some insights into like how to identify criteria and evaluate the choices that I've made.
And what does that mean, looping and skipping?
And I think that that is really what is powerful in the learning enterprise, is to use assessment as a tool to help close the gap between where we are currently and where we want students to be in the future.
So based on this, like, what do you feel like the next instructional move would be based on the data that we're seeing here?
So I think one of the things that
You need to know where your kids are, where you're going, and it's never done.
Kids aren't just like this linear set of data, but they're dynamic and messy. Assessment for learning, it really helps all kids and it raises all boats.
All right, so from that foundation, I'm going to dive into a couple of things. I'm going to go over this pretty quickly, but we've created rubrics, and you can use those hyperlinks to get at some of the rubrics that we've created, but rubrics that help us define problem solving, decision making, as well as effective reasoning. And there's some key things that I would highlight as you look at one of these rubrics. One is they do define a continuum from beginning to exemplary. And then the separate thing is that they create individual components of each of those constructs. And why that is unique or different is that, like, if you look at like a writing rubric for the PARCC assessment, it's going to lump everything about critical thinking into one category and not sort of unpack what is the difference between, say, making an effective claim and then finding the correct support and then linking that support back to the claim. They put it all together as one piece. And by separating those things and then creating a continuum for it, we can help identify very specific places where kids are struggling and then give them direct feedback and direct instruction that help them close those gaps. And then so the same thing goes for like problem solving, as well as our decision-making rubric. And so the key things here are they define the construct that we want to teach and assess for students. And it helps teachers know what they're supposed to be teaching. And then each component on the rubric is mutually exclusive. And so we can look at, say, on that problem solving rubric, I can see that identifying what is known about this problem or what kind of background knowledge I need to draw on to solve this problem is really different than just defining the problem itself. And so while some kids might be able to really see this is what the problem's all about, other kids might need some more direct instruction and help around identifying what is known, and vice versa. Like there might be kids that know one thing versus another. And then the last piece, and I've mentioned this already, is the rubric defines this continuum of growth from novice to expert. You'll notice in our rubrics, we've created them slightly differently for each of the constructs. In the effective reasoning one, we have separate ones by grade band. So there's a preschool, pre-K, there's a K1, there's a 2-3. And then in the problem solving rubric, though, we started to use it with teachers and classes, and all of our teachers felt like the same rubric was working fairly well on the teacher side for everybody to use the same rubric. And then the last one is for the decision making. We have created an early childhood one that our preschool through our kindergarten teachers use that is slightly different than the decision making one that we use for our older grades. But we've done that mostly based on two things. One is what our teachers found was useful. And then we went back and worked with the Stanford Center on Assessment, Learning and Equity to standardize those assessments and to validate them. And so from that work is how we ended up with different scales or different rubrics for different places. And now I'm gonna pause here and see if there are any questions. If you do have questions, please just put them in the chat. And then Preeti, if you can shout out any that might be coming up.
Yeah, I don't see any yet. Let me refresh my page. Give folks a minute or two to put them in. No questions.
Okay.
That I can see yet.
Yep. All right. Well, let's jump right into the assessment component. And we're going to focus really on one particular task, a problem-solving task, and looking at that problem-solving rubric that I had before, this one here. And as we think about that, we're going to look at this problem, and I'm just going to walk you straight through the problem. And I will tell you, like I said, it's a lot of fun. So I'd encourage you to consider doing this at home. And if you have kids, do it with kids. If you don't, it's fun for adults as well. But the problem is you're going to be given a set of materials and you want to create the largest bridge span you possibly can between two cups. And the big idea here is just you want to create a span that doesn't touch the floor between the two cups. And it's not, the goal is not really to hold something up, but just really to create something that's really long that's suspended between two cups. And the whole point of this, and I tell everybody before we get started with it, and when we're doing it with kids or with adults, the point is not necessarily just to make the largest bridge span. That's the problem you're solving. But what I really want to see is you to make your thinking visible. And we have a template that we use with this assessment where you make your thinking visible. And I have in those hyperlinks, there's a hyperlink to some student work from this exact assessment. And you can kind of see what that might look like for a student to make their thinking visible. But I really emphasize that point because this is an assessment of thinking, and while it is intended to be fun and there is a collaborative element to it, there's also this independent piece of making your thinking visible. And I want kids to really understand, or whoever's taking the assessment, that that's the goal. And that while there's other things that are gonna happen in this space, you really wanna go back to the goal, which is making their thinking visible. All right, and so with that, they're given 4 rubber bands, 2 sheets of paper, and 12 inches of tape. And then I usually use like red Solo cups or something like that, but you have 2 cups. And then the rules are the bridge must stand independently. Between the 2 cups, you do not have to use all of the materials. You can cut up or use only a piece of any material. For adults, I do not give any other material. So like you don't get scissors. If you want to cut, you just rip, right? For kids, you might consider giving them scissors or something like that, but then I would add that to the materials list if you do that. Once again, it doesn't matter that much what the materials are. The real point is, how do you help kids think through a problem like this? And then you're not allowed to use any additional materials. Okay. And then here's the real crux of the assessment, is that there's 5 minutes of individual planning, followed by 5 minutes of group planning. With kids, I usually do this in pairs. With adults, I'll do it in larger groups, probably 3 to 4 people in a group. And then I give 7.5 minutes of a work session where they work on building their bridge. And then I come back to 5 minutes of individual reflection. And then 7.5 minutes of a work session, and then finish with 10 minutes to measure results, which is less important. And then the last piece is another 5 minutes of individual reflection. And I'm going to tell you right now that this is the DC Data Summit, all of the data comes in that first 5 minutes, the middle 5 minutes of individual reflection, and the last 5 minutes of individual reflection. Those are the places where you're actually collecting data on kids' thinking. And in all of our assessments, there is this component of individual planning and thinking and making their thinking visible. One of the questions that I've had with both our staff and talking to other researchers, so like I've had a conversation with Ron Richard about this, as well as the folks at the Stanford Center on Assessment and Learning and Equity, is the nature of language in critical thinking. Language is so essential, and so it is really, really important that kids are making their thinking visible, and that often, particularly with those older grades, it's in writing. But I would name that, particularly like with second language learners or with students with special needs, you can make your thinking visible orally as well. And with our younger students, it might be through demonstrating their work. And so in both of those cases, whether it is oral or in some kind of demonstration, I just look for ways for us to capture that thinking in those ways too, because ultimately it is about them making their thinking seen and heard and understood by someone else. And so being open to collecting data in other ways is really key. And those are fine accommodations, because this is not a writing assessment, right? It's an assessment of thinking. And so I give that as a caveat. And then we go to scoring some student work. And the way that we do that is we take that rubric. And so the rubric that I showed you before, and then we take the student work, and I go through this with teachers. I say, trust the data in front of you, stick to the language of the rubric, only use whole number scores, and when in doubt, give the lower score. Key things there are, teachers come to any set of data with bias, and so how do we work to mitigate that bias? Having teachers score a class of work from another class has been one powerful way that we do that. Another really powerful way is really just reminding and pushing them to use the language of the rubric, and that emphasizing that the power of using this is really around formative assessment data. And then the last piece is really around consistency and standardization of the scoring, is to use whole number scores versus using, oh, this seems to be like a 3.5. And then I asked teachers, like, why is that a 3.5? Like, what is the language in the 3 that says it's definitely, like, it's got all of the things there? And then what in the 4 that it does not have? And in doing that, I help them sort of unpack where is the space that doesn't make it quite a 4 yet. And that is the feedback that you want to give to a student. And so by helping them see, okay, it's still a 3, here's what would make it a 4, is where the power lies. And so not giving those like half points is about really identifying where in the language it is clear, and then it standardizes our scores, and so we have consistency across the way that everybody is scoring, and just creates that inter-rater reliability. We would then review the student work and ask, how do the questions we ask students tie back to the rubrics? And so what I'd encourage you to do is take a look at the student work samples that I gave you, and then think about how are we eliciting thinking that would get us back and get us data that would tell us how kids are doing on the rubrics. And then the last piece is, how have students made their thinking visible? And so you can take a look at those student work. And I've got 2 different students in that work that you can see how they've made their thinking visible around problem solving. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to take a look at that. And I'll just show you real quickly, this is what the students are given, which shows the problem itself. And then here is the thinking that a student created under what do you know, what do you want to know, and what are some ideas that you have about solving the problem. And then just to remind you, so this is a thinking routine that we use regularly in class, but it's also, this is what links directly back to that rubric. So it's thinking about, what do you already know about this problem, and like what is the background knowledge that you're bringing to solve this problem. And then the what do you want to know portion is the what is it that you're trying to solve. And then the last piece is, what are some ideas that you have, and that spurs the kids to start to make a plan to solve the problem. And then they move on, and this is where they start to more iterate and give more direction around how they solve the problem. And so thinking about, what will you try first? What will you try second? And then in their own words, explain the problem that they're trying to solve. And so that's where we end before they go off to do their first trial. And then they go off and work in pairs to create bridges. And once they've done that, they work for 7.5 minutes, and then they pause. And I call this a metacognitive moment in our classes, where I ask kids to stop and think about, what are they doing? What is their thinking? It is completely unnatural. And I feel like it is an important instructional move that we need to be aware of and name for kids, that we are asking you to pause in a set of work right now to think about your process. And it's so that you can get better about thinking about your process. And so that's often very hard for kids, but naming it is helpful, and it's helpful to help them start to move in that direction. And then, and what they did is here is, like, think about, what did you create, what worked or didn't work, and what will you try next? It's really just giving them the opportunity to evaluate themselves mid-process. And you'll note that in this, we give them an opportunity to draw pictures, and it is really valuable that as we look at this data, as we're not simply scoring based on words alone, but on all of the data that a kid gives us. And so they're giving us information both in their answer as well as in the picture as they think about it. And then they do it again. And so this is after the second building, and this is where they actually reflect, and they give this last section, which is what could be improved in the design of your bridge, and if you were going to complete this task again, what would you do differently? And it really unpacks for the kids that last part of the rubric, which is how would you evaluate what you did and how would you do it differently, and what was successful or not successful, and unpacking both the product of the work that they did, but also the process that they've gone through, like what was effective about your problem solving. And so you can kind of get a sense of, this was a fourth grader that did this, but so I'd choose to put my bridge on a higher platform so it would not be so close to touching the ground. And so they were thinking about, like, is there a way to keep those spaces suspended? All right, and then in scoring the work, we give teachers multiple opportunities to score collectively. It's a time-consuming process, but it's really important to calibrate scoring with teachers. And I think that that's true with anything, and it's about how to create inter-rater reliability. And I would say, like, even with whatever system you're in, how do you create inter-rater reliability with grading anything, right? And then allow teachers an opportunity to unpack the places where there's inconsistency. So we use a protocol where teachers score the same pieces of work together, and then look at what are the elements that they scored similarly, what are the elements that they might have scored differently, and really spend the time, like, zoomed in on the places where they may have scored differently. And then we provide an authoritative final score with a rationale for that score. And I really push the teachers to come up with that. Like, what is the final score for this piece of work, and why is that the final score? And it's really about building consensus on that, and then creating some anchor papers that we can then use consistently after the fact, whenever they use these kind of performance assessments in the future. And so just a question for you to think about now is, how do these tasks like this give us insight into students' critical thinking and problem solving skills? And what ways might you use these in your context? And so I'm going to give you some time right now to ponder that question. And then if you have questions for me, put them in the chat.
Keeping an eye on this Tuba chat. Waiting for some responses to come in. I actually have a question, Jeff.
Sure.
So you mentioned that this is something that can be used for older students and potentially adults as well. So what is a little bit different? Like, how might this look differently if you're working with older students? And how are you thinking about that scoring and interpreting for the teachers, maybe differently or the same?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, I would use it fairly similarly for adults. There's a couple of key things that I feel like are really important regardless. One is naming for them that this is about your critical thinking skills, and it doesn't matter too much actually what the task is. And so I try to find tasks that are really authentic and engaging. Building a bridge might not be the most exciting. I find that's engaging for kids from second grade up, because they have some, and all the way to adults, and that adults can get into some kinds of engineering tasks, but that I think that's key. And then the second piece is, in terms of the scoring, like our higher level rubrics, the rubrics that we use with our middle school students. So we're a preschool through 8th grade, would work for adults as well. so that, I think that that captures that. I think the really key thing is going to be, as we talk about the assessment piece, I mean the teaching piece, which is thinking about the thinking routines and how we use them with kids. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we as a staff use them with our own decision-making process or problem-solving process as well. But all of our performance assessments are intended to have some element of authenticity, and so I think about that with adults as well, and you can kind of see how that plays out in a minute. Are there other questions?
Nope, real quiet on the chat over here. Maybe
right.
back to the question before as
Yep.
well. That way folks can kind of see it and think about it a little bit more just in case.
Sure.
Feel free, if you have questions or issues with using the Whova session Q&A and chat, please message me through the app so that I can make sure that I'm supporting you in that as well.
Okay, cool. All right. I'm going to dive into the teach portion, and that's really focusing on thinking routines. So we have a thinking routine that aligns with each of the constructs that we just talked about. So we have a problem-solving thinking routine, an effective reasoning thinking routine, and a decision-making one. The whole idea behind a thinking routine is that it is that it's just like any other routine. It has to be done over and over and over and over again for kids or for adults to integrate it into their regular habits. And so like ultimately we want to create like habits of mind. So just like, oh, I know what the routine is for how we line up and go to lunch, or what the routine is for when we first enter class and get started on work. I know the routine for how we problem solve in this class and across classes. And we use typically like 3-letter acronyms to talk about them. So for the problem solving one, it's KWI. What do you know? What do you need to find out? What are your ideas for solutions? For effective reasoning, it's CSQ. So what is your claim? What is your support? And what is your question? And the question really for older kids is really moving them beyond just questioning their claim to actually creating a counterclaim. And how would you, in your argument, address that counterclaim? And then the last piece is under decision making. We talk about the 4 C's of what are your choices? What are your criteria for evaluating those choices? Then how do you compare those choices? And then last, how do you choose effectively? And then we had a 5th grader who felt like, oh, there should be a 5th C, which is what are the consequences of your choice? But one of the things that is really important in thinking about all of these routines is that they're not subject specific. We use them all over the place, from math class to science class to our English classes. And then we also, in our PE, we use them on the playground. So we use like the problem solving one when kids are just unpacking a social problem that they might have. Or if we're trying to make a decision, we'll pull out the decision making routine. But I'm going to give you some specific examples from different grades. And then I'll finish with a couple of examples where we have used it as adult staff as well. But for 2nd grade, we'll talk about the effective reasoning one. This is from a teacher who created she created an anchor chart in her classroom to unpack and define what each of those components are. So what does it mean to make a claim? What does it mean to support the claim? And what is the question? And you can kind of see how she defined those. So using sources available to make a statement, use evidence to back up your claim. What would someone else say to challenge their claim? And then she took our rubric for claim support question, and she created a student-friendly version of it. She added some graphics as well as thinking about like what is a 1, 2, 3, or 4. So that's applying from the novice level to expert. So 4 being the expert level. And what were they looking for kids to produce that like higher quality reasoning throughout. And by defining that for kids are better able to own it and use it. And then the key thing is she's got to make it a routine. She got to use it regularly in class. And the way that she was using it regularly in class was doing a couple of different things. One is she had a regular routine of would you rather that would come up at least like once a week, where she'd ask, would you rather, and in this case, be the leader of a country on Earth or start a new colony on a different planet? And then in that case, kids still have to make a claim and they have to support it. And so what would effective support in that case look like? They're not necessarily drawing on lots of external resources, but they're drawing on their own experience in doing that. But getting it as a regular routine that when I make a claim, I have to support it and I have to link that support to my claim. Another regular routine that they did in that class, and we've done this with even like our younger kids, with kindergartners, is giving a small snapshot of a picture and say, it's a, and then the kids have to make a claim as to what it is. So just taking a look at this picture, they come up with what do they think's happening in the picture, and they have to support it with the visual evidence that they have in front of them. And then they get the full image though, and have to explain what they think was happening and whether or not their claim was supported or not from that. And so still doing the CSQ there. And then we move to applying it to content. And our students do a civics expedition or project every year, where kids collect a lot of data and then have to make a claim about that data and create like a law for the school. And a law that kids were thinking about was about how do we make our environment more friendly at Two Rivers. And so this is an example of a student's work about creating a green policy at Two Rivers, thinking about reusable water bottles. And so she made the argument that we should use water bottles, and you can kind of see the support that she drew on in making that. I don't think that she addressed a counterclaim necessarily in this, but this kind of gives you a sense of where you could go with that work. Now I'm going to switch up to some of our middle school students and about thinking routines. And this is in our 7th graders. And our 7th graders do some projects around decision making. And then you can see this is an anchor chart that was in one of our 7th grade classrooms, but still unpacking those 4 C's for kids so that they can use them more effectively. And the way that this teacher used those 4 C's was around job applications at the beginning of the school year. And so having kids think about what are the different jobs that you're going, that we need in our classroom, and then what are the criteria that we should use to determine whether or not somebody is good at that particular job, or their application should be accepted for that job. And then she has them fill out applications and apply for the different jobs in the class. But using the 4 C's as a way for them to, 1, make the decision about what they're going to apply for, and then 2, make the decision about who should be given certain jobs. And then she thought about, how do we apply this to content? And then you can see this is from a project that we do around the memorials and things and the history in our city. And this was focused specifically on a project that was focused in that area, but on the history component to it, and during Reconstruction. So what do you propose happened to the Confederate leaders? So if you were making a decision, if you were the leader, what would you say that should happen? And now, who should own the plantations? Or would you be willing to promise the northern politicians that if you gave they gave you land, that you would continue to grow cotton on it? Should that be a requirement or not? And so kids had to draw on their history knowledge to answer those questions. But in the same way, though, they still had to identify, like, what are our choices here? What are our criteria for making those choices? And then how do we compare those choices? And how do we make a final choice in making their argument? So once again, just like using that as a regular routine. And then you can see somebody asked about, are there materials for families to use? And I would say that this is where the rubber hits the road for me, is like, using these kinds of thinking routines is what builds them as, like I said, a habit of mind. And these are the tools that I would pool to use with families, and giving them just these the language of, here are the 4 C's, and giving regular assignments in a virtual environment makes a lot of sense. I can ask you to make a claim and support it, but then giving it to families to say, you know what, kids are making choices all the time, or are having to make arguments. And we see kids use these pretty regularly, and sometimes for purposes that are on the kids' own, for the kids' own benefit. So for example, we've had kids who have made claims to their parents with support for why they need a later bedtime, or kids making an argument as to why they should be able to go to the store on their own, for our middle school students. But those are examples where if they're making a support, then they're working on those critical thinking skills on their own. And then the last piece that I would say about these thinking routines is, we use these regularly as a leadership team. And so when we're making a decision as a leadership team, we pull out the 4 C's and talk about what explicitly are our criteria for making decisions. And then we'll create these pros and cons charts using that criteria to help us make those decisions. Similar, just the same way that we might do it with students. Also, when we're solving problems, we often will talk about a KWI. What do we know about this problem that we're facing? What are the ways that we might define that problem? And then what are our ideas for solutions? And so I feel like it has made our work better as a school, but it's also been thinking about, like, how do these routines become sort of in the fabric of what we do all of the time to improve our thinking processes and be more effective critical thinkers and problem solvers. And so I'm going to just finish with an opportunity for you guys to think about some synthesis. The key idea here is that if we really do care about kids becoming critical thinkers and problem solvers, then we need assessment that aligns to that. And one big piece that I feel like is true is that our assessments currently bundle lots of it, when they do get at critical thinking, and they don't always, but when they do, they bundle it with content knowledge. And it's really hard to tease out, is a kid a good reader, or are they a good critical thinker? And being able to tease those two things out feels really important to me. Like, if we want kids to be really good at both, then we need to have good information about both that is separate. And so creating assessment that gets at those specific outcomes is important. And then separately, we need to make sure that instruction is really driving towards those outcomes and is aligned with the ways that we might assess. And so with that in mind, that's how we've created those rubrics, and then aligned performance assessment that goes with it. And then finally, thinking about what are the thinking routines that kids can use regularly that teach towards those outcomes and move kids towards stronger critical thinking and problem solving skills. All right, so I'm going to